Hey guys, today we're going to do pretty much the same thing as what we did yesterday, except today we're going to have a greatest common factor to factor out when possible. So we're going to have a GCF right here at step number one when possible. So we're going to still identify from A, B, and C. We're going to do the X factor here, and then we're going to do the expand version, and then we're going to factor out our GCF, and then we're going to have our leftovers. So let's take a look at the first example. Step number one is our GCF. And when you look at that GCF, you're just going to plug it into your calculator, GCF, and it's going to be all three terms. So it's GCF 2, comma, -8, comma, -24, and it tells us that our GCF is 2. So that's what we're going to pull out is the GCF of 2. So when we pull that out, we're going to divide out a 2 out of every single term. And then that's going to give us x squared minus 4x minus 12. And that's what we're going to be looking at when we identify our A, B, and C. So step number 2 is A equals 1, B equals -4, and C equals -12. Then we're going to do the X factor. A times C, so 1 times -12 is -12, which adds together to give me B for the bottom, -4. My factors of -12 are 1 times -12, 2 times -6, and 3 times -4. I need them to add up to be -4. So when I add them, 1 plus -12 is -11. 2 plus -6 is -4, and 3 plus -4 is -1. The one that works is the one that is -4, and that would be 2 and -6. Next is the expand. So we're going to have 4 lines, but it's important for you to pull from the new part, the new trinomial, and it's going to be x squared and -12. And then your middle two terms come from the middle part of your x, 2x and -6x. Now we're going to factor by grouping. We're going to group together the first two terms and the last two terms. Looking for the GCF of the first two, they have a 1 in common, and they also have an x in common. So I'm going to pull out an x. When I pull out that x, we have x, and what's left over, x squared divided by x is just x. 2x divided by x, my x's cancel, and I've got +2. On this one, you have to pull out a negative. And my GCF in between these two is 6. So a -6. And what's left over is -6 divided by -6 cancels. I'm left with an x. -12 divided by -6, a negative divided by a negative is a positive. 12 divided by 6 is 2. My two parentheses are identical, so I write them down once. And then my GCFs go in a parenthesis together, so x minus 6. And that's my final answer. No, it's not. I'm sorry. You got to have your GCF from step number 1. My GCF from step number 1 is a 2, so you got to have that 2 from the very beginning. That sits out in the beginning. So that's how you do this entire problem from start to finish. Turn the page over. Let's try another problem. Let's look through to find the GCF of this problem. So we have 3, comma, negative 15, comma, 12. And you see that the GCF is 3. So I'm going to pull out a GCF of 3. And then I'm going to divide that 3 by every term. 3 divided by 3 cancels. I'm left with x squared, or 1x squared. Negative 15 divided by 3 is negative 5x. 12 divided by 3 is a positive 4. Next, we have an a, which is 1, b, which is negative 5, and c, which is 4. Next, I'm going to do my x factor. A times c, so 1 times 4 is 4, but they have to add together to give me negative 5. And when that happens, both factors have to be negative. So we got a positive 4. We have negative 1 times negative 4, and negative 2 times negative 2. The one that has to add up to give me negative 5, negative 2 plus negative 2 is negative 4, negative 1 plus negative 4 is negative 5. So this is the one that works right here. So I'm going to write that down. The next step is to expand. I'm going to write out 4 blanks for my 4 terms. Remember, my first term comes from right here. My last term comes from right here. So I've got x squared and a positive 4. My middle 2 terms come from the middle part of my x, negative 1x and negative 4x. Next, I'm going to factor by grouping. I'm going to group together my first 2 terms and my last 2 terms, and I'm going to look for my greatest common factor in my first 2 terms. That greatest common factor is an x, so I'm going to pull it out and see what's left over. X squared divided by x is just an x. Negative 1x divided by x, my x's divide away, and I'm left with just negative 1. This negative sign drops down, so I know I'm pulling out a negative. My GCF in between these two is a 4, so I'm pulling out a negative 4. And what's left over? Negative 4 divided by negative 4 is a positive 1, so I'm left with just an x, 1x. And positive 4 divided by negative 4 is a negative 1. My parentheses are exactly the same, so I'm going to write it down one time. And my GCFs, my blue numbers, is x minus 4. And then my GCF from the very beginning, from step 1, was a 3. So I have to put that 3 out in the front. Let's take a look at this next one. My GCF on this one, if I take a look at it and plug it in, is 3, comma 30, comma 63. And notice that it's a 3. But I also noticed something else. They all three have an x in common. So my GCF is 3x on this one. So I'm going to pull out a 3x out of all three terms. So I have 3x, open parentheses. 3 divided by 3 is 1. X cubed divided by x is x squared. 30 divided by 3 is 10. X squared divided by x is x. 63 divided by 3 is 21. And my x's, they cancel. So remember, you're pulling from this problem right here where x squared and positive 21 is your numbers that you're going to use in the expanded version. And my A is 1 inside the parentheses. My B is 10 inside the parenthesis. And my C is 21 inside the parenthesis. I'm going to make my X now. A times C, 1 times 21 is 21. My B is 10. So my factors of 21 is 1 times 21 and 3 times 7. When I go to add those, 1 and 21 makes 22. 3 plus 7 is 10. That's the one that I needed, was 3 and 7. So next step is to expand. So I am going to do x squared and 21 coming from here and here. My middle two terms are 3x and a positive 7x. That 3 was positive, so it gets a plus sign. Now I'm going to factor by grouping. So I'm going to group together the first two terms and the last two terms. My GCF in my first two terms is an x, so I'm going to pull that out. And what's left over is an x and a positive 3 because my x's cancel. And this sign comes down, so it's a positive. And my GCF in between 7 and 21 is 7. So I'm going to pull out a positive 7. And what's left over? 7 divided by 7 is 1, so I'm left with 1x. And 21 divided by a positive 7 is a positive 3. My parenthesis is identical, so I'm going to write it down one time. X plus 3. And then I have x plus 7 in the other parenthesis. Last but not least is my GCF from the very beginning. And remember, it was a 3x. So it goes in the front of my GCF parenthesis. That's where I'm going to stop, and then I'll make a part 2 video that you'll need to watch so you can get these last two examples.